Alright, so, by 1995, Mainframe Entertainment was in a pretty good place. Having now put themselves on the map with the success of their first series, ReBoot, the studio was approached by Hasbro, a huge toy and game company behind franchises like G.I. Joe, My Little Pony, and Action Man, to create a spin-off of their popular 1984 series, The Transformers. Like Transformers, and unlike ReBoot, the primary purpose of this cartoon would be as a marketing material to drive sales of an associated toy line of transforming action figures by the same name. What neither Mainframe nor Hasbro knew at the time, however, was that this show would not only become one of the most popular iterations of the Transformers franchise, completely reinvigorating interest in the brand, but it would also go down in history, joining ReBoot as one of the best children's cartoons of the 90s. This show was, of course, called Beasties. Wait, what? Beasties? I thought it was called Beast Wars. Hang on a sec, this can't be right. Yes, actually, this is right. Exclusively in Mainframe Entertainment's home country of Canada, Beast Wars was instead known as Beasties, due to a censorship mandate on the word war. Though, hilariously, this censorship would not extend to the associated toy line, which I'm sure didn't do much to help brand awareness in Canada. I mean, could you even imagine a franchise marketed primarily towards children and preteens having the audacity to put the word wars in the title? Beast Wars represented an even more difficult challenge technically than ReBoot had. Being set in the real world rather than inside the virtual space of a computer, Mainframe's animation team would need to pioneer many CGI techniques over the course of the show that had never been done before on a television budget.
People falling into the water, very, very difficult to do. Fog, mist, which you can do easily in classic. You can do well in CGI, but they managed to do almost everything they told us not to do by the end of the show.
I mean, every day you were breaking new ground. Every day somebody would go, look what I figured out. And you'd be looking at it, you're going like, that is really cool. And no one's ever done it before.
It's far more difficult to animate an organic form that's biological, that we recognize what it should look like. We recognize how it should move.
Not only the animal forms, but the robot forms as well would require quite a lot of work to get right. Since the purpose of the show was to sell toys, Beast Wars characters needed to be modeled after the toys they were based on, in addition to looking good on screen, which, with some of the early Beast Wars figure designs, meant taking some liberties. This was partially due to the fact that Takara, the Japanese company designing and manufacturing these toys, had yet to work out all the kinks in the animal transformation engineering process. As you can see here, some of the early Beast Wars test models resembled their toy counterparts much more closely than the final product that would eventually appear in the show's first season. The constraints of designing around a toy line also meant that Hasbro had several mandates for the writers as well as the animators.
The picking of the characters and what characters we wanted to focus on for our product line, thus needing to be in the animation, and the direction of those character bios and colors were very much led by the Hasbro toy team.
We said to them, we want every single piece of the toy is going to be on screen on those models. And we almost blew, we blew our whole budget on the characters.
The extreme amount of detail poured into these character models would end up accounting for so much of the show's budget that very little ended up being left for backgrounds and other visual elements, leading to Season 1 of Beast Wars looking a bit sparse. In any case, when Beast Wars Transformers premiered September 16th, 1996, it was immediately clear that this was not your dad's Transformers. Aside from both shows being set around a conflict between two sets of warring Transformer factions, instead of Autobots and Decepticons, now it's Maximals and Predacons, there really aren't too many comparisons to be had between Beast Wars and the original Transformers. Beast Wars follows Optimus Primal, captain of a Maximal exploratory vessel that gets rerouted shortly before the start of the pilot episode to pursue a ship of renegade Predacons led by Megatron. After dropping out of transwarp, these two ships fatally damage each other, resulting in a mutual crash landing on a nearby planet. The planet is excessively abundant in the Transformers' primary power source, Energon.
Too much Energon. Continued exposure to robotic forms will result in permanent damage.
This necessitates the adoption of alternate beast modes capable of staving off energon exposure, based on local life forms native to the planet. The ever-looming threat of energon exposure provides adequate context for why the Transformers would have to transform in the first place, since unlike in the original series, there's no need for any of them to be robots in disguise among the denizens of a prehistoric planet. It's also sort of implied that most of the characters changed their names at the start of the series upon adopting their beast forms, but this is never really addressed explicitly.
Call me Rattrap.
In other words, just roll with it. It may not make a ton of sense, but come on, you want some transforming in your Transformers series or what? By the way, this pre-beast form Megatron character model seen here in the pilot episode is mostly recycled from the Megazord Gundam thing that was in that one episode of ReBoot's second season.
Huh, go figure.
As it turns out, arriving on this particular planet was all part of Megatron's plan. Sort of. Maybe? It's stated by Dinobot here that the original plan was to get to Earth, but then Megatron says it doesn't matter whether or not this planet is Earth because it has enough energon on it to serve their needs regardless. Even though after the pilot, you don't often see them fighting over energon deposits anyway. Instead, each episode usually pits the Maximals and the Predacons in a struggle to gain some tactical advantage over the other group.
The emitter is ready. In 15 cycles, we'll be inside the Maximal base.
Additionally, every now and then a MacGuffin will fall out of the sky in the form of a stasis pod, one of the embryonic crew members of the Maximal ship jettisoned before the crash. Despite the fact that these pods contain Maximals by default, they're simple enough to reprogram if the Preds get to one first. So whenever one of them lands, both teams have to race to try and get to it before the other in order to bolster their ranks with new members. Occasionally, you'll also get an episode that feeds into this ancient alien mystery subplot that'll get developed more, sort of, in seasons 2 and 3. One thing that really stood out to me about Beast Wars is that unlike with ReBoot, you can really tell there were no censorship restrictions on the type of content they were allowed to include, or at least very few. This was because unlike ReBoot, which was proprietary to the ABC network and was as such subject to the whims of their censorship board, Beast Wars, a spin-off of an already established franchise, was syndicated right from the get-go and had a lot more freedom to include things like violence. So much glorious violence. You see robots getting hit, stabbed, crushed, shot up, or blown to pieces in pretty much every episode. These clips here are just a few instances that I picked out. The most frequent recipient of this punishment is the Predacon Waspinator, whose frequent destruction would go on to become a running gag throughout the series.
No, Waspinator has a headache in his whole body.
Actually, let's talk about the characters, because one of the major differences between Beast Wars and G1 Transformers was in how the shows handle their casts. Throughout most of G1, Optimus Prime and Megatron were more or less treated like infallible leaders by their respective armies, with the one notable exception to this rule being Starscream, who would seize upon any opportunity to take control of the Decepticons for himself.
Megatron has fallen! Starscream, I'm now your leader!
But on Beast Wars, both Megatron and Optimus Primal would frequently be talked back to or challenged by their subordinates. This was a creative decision made by Beast Wars writers. Unlike in G1, where audience interest in buying the toys could be retained fairly easily by constantly putting new robots on screen every week, budgetary constraints only allowed for a finite number of characters to be available for use on Beast Wars at any given time. So to compensate for this, more effort had to be put into making each of them feel more fleshed out as individuals, which often took the form of having them bicker and argue with one another constantly.
We felt like we were constantly enclosed in this glass box of we only have a certain number of sets, we only have a certain number of characters. Our job was to keep the audience always looking inward so nobody would notice how close against the walls we constantly were of what we couldn't do. Instead, we would make sure that the story concentrated on what we could do really well. And, you know, we had learned from the animators, and one of the things we could do really well was we got great acting out of those robots, and so our characters had to squabble a lot, and in that squabbling, it allowed us to really bring out some really neat aspects of those characters.
Optimus Primal may be the leader of the Maximals, but unlike his big red predecessor, Primal is never really portrayed as the biggest, baddest bot in town. At least not at first. He's got a lot more personality than Prime ever did, and he seems constantly put upon, even getting snippy on occasion when his men give him too much crap.
Let's get one thing straight, Rattrap. I am commander of this group, and when I give an order, I expect it to be obeyed.
Oh, yeah?
Besides Optimus, the Maximal team in Season 1 is made up of Cheetor, a fun-loving and carefree cheetah that, as the most childlike character, serves as a kind of audience surrogate, Rhinox, a rhinoceros who doubled as the team's mechanic and spiritual center, Rattrap, a smartass, wise-talking rat specializing in espionage and demolition, and Dinobot, a standoffish ex-Predacon who defects to the Maximals in the pilot episode. These five are eventually joined by Tigatron, a nature-loving tiger who preferred to remain in beast form out in the wilderness rather than join his comrades at the base, and Airazor, who is a hawk. She can fly! Honestly, when you get right down to it, our heroes are a pretty dysfunctional lot, apart from most of the Maximals not really being fighters.
This is ridiculous! We're an exploration ship, not a battle cruiser!
The only two consistently level-headed ones of the bunch are Optimus and Rhinox. Cheetor constantly messes things up.
If you ever pull a stunt like that again, I'll have your tail in a sling.
Okay, I'll never do that again. Until the next time.
Tigatron is a pacifist who at one point actually tries to quit the Beast Wars. Then there's Rattrap and Dinobot, who, when not constantly fighting amongst themselves or questioning Optimus's orders, can usually be found complaining about present circumstances or skulking alone in a corner, respectively. These Maximals would probably have their work cut out for them if not for the fact that the Predacons are even more incompetent and ineffectual of a unit than they are, despite having a distinct numbers advantage throughout a lot of the series. This new Megatron is a megalomaniac with delusions of grandeur, who thinks he's a lot smarter than he actually is.
I beg your pardon? What did you call me?
You heard. You are an idiot and an incompetent leader.
His ranks include Terrorsaur, a pterodactyl and the most treacherous character, who, like Starscream before him, attempts to take control of the Predacons at every turn. Tarantulas, a mad scientist tarantula who starts to show hints of an ulterior motive towards the end of Season 1. Waspinator, the aforementioned comedic relief. And Scorponok, the only Predacon actually loyal to Megatron, who, coincidentally, is probably the least developed character in the series. The Predacons are later joined by Blackarachnia, a Black Widow spider femme fatale, and Inferno, a fire ant who thinks he's a real boy, referring to the Predacon base as the Colony, and even calling Megatron my queen on occasion.
Yes, my queen. I wish she wouldn't call me that.
If it seems to you like I'm ragging a bit on the characters here, please understand that that is absolutely not my intention. These Transformers actually feel like people, complete with faults that make sense in context. If I was Rattrap, I'd totally be complaining about everything. As he points out several times throughout the season, theirs was supposed to be a mission of science and exploration, not combat.
Playing Galactic Patrol wasn't nowhere in my job description, you know what I'm saying?
It similarly feels natural that Dinobot wouldn't really gel with the rest of the Maximals, being an ex-Predacon who was originally part of Megatron's group. It even makes sense that the Predacons make such an awful team to begin with, since Megatron and his cohorts are rogue Predacons. Back on Cybertron, the Transformer homeworld, Maximals and Predacons have more or less been at peace for centuries, so it follows that the only people Megatron could convince to go along with him on his insane mission would either be crazy zealots or complete idiots. In some cases, both. These characters are all incredibly fun to watch, and their interactions and interpersonal relationships are what really make the show worth the watch more than anything else. Brought to life, of course, by some strong voice performances. As I said in my ReBoot Season 2 video, there's a lot of overlap between that series and Beast Wars in terms of voice actors used. I'd say that the strongest links in Season 1's cast are probably Garry Chalk as Optimus Primal, David Kaye as Megatron, Scott McNeil as Rattrap, Scott McNeil as Dinobot, and Scott McNeil as Waspinator. Yeah, McNeil wore a lot of hats on this show.
Optimus is insane to waste my talents on a futile hunt.
I do think though that like with ReBoot, Beast Wars voiceover work is pretty great across the board, so kudos to all of these folks, as well as the voice director, Susan Blue. Wait a second, Susan Blue? Wasn't that... Huh, no kidding. Speaking of connections to G1, this was actually quite a big point of contention amongst existing Transformers fans when Beast Wars first started, causing its first season to be met with a decidedly mixed reaction.
For a long time, it was quite polarizing. Some people thought, this is not what I grew up with or want, and then other people were like, this is brand new for me and I think it's awesome.
While Beast Wars was overwhelmingly embraced right off the bat by my generation of 90s kids, older fans of the original series were quick to call foul on the new show. This was because, at first glance, Beast Wars had very little to do with its predecessor, being set hundreds of years in the future with nary an Autobot nor Decepticon to be seen, and the Maximals and Predacons that were there changed into animals rather than vehicles or other types of machinery. In fact, series developers Larry DiTilio and Bob Forward knew next to nothing about the original Transformers going into Beast Wars, and had to look it up or be told about it as they went along.
The old show we hadn't seen much of. The fans wanted us to make the original Transformers again. They wanted to see Starscream and they wanted to see Optimus.
I wrote the pilot without really knowing anything. But I made mention of a great war.
Remember the Great War, Rattrap. If the Predacons get enough energon, they'll start it again.
They assumed that it was talking about the war between the Autobots and the Decepticons. Well, I just meant, okay, there was this great war, and that kind of explains why the Predacons and the Maximals were constantly fighting.
They didn't want to see Optimus Primal the monkey, or Tarantulas the spider. They really wanted to see those old robots. And that was a little rift between us and the fans right from the beginning.
So in the fan community, there is kind of a side, truck not monkey, monkey not truck.
Anyone else hear enough of an old fart to remember when that was a thing? Sound off in the comments.
We were sort of lurking for quite a long time, just reading the fan reactions to stuff. And we can't help it, we're writers. We see little seeds here and there that actually help tie it into the original Transformers.
Unicron! By the Matrix.
I am Shrapnel Decepticon here. Oh.
Shrapnel? That was a Decepticon from the Great War.
More than meets the eye.
Some of my favorite episodes from Season 1 of Beast Wars include The Spark, which has probably the farthest reaching creative decision from Beast Wars throughout the rest of the Transformers franchise. This episode introduces the concept of, well, the spark, which is sort of like the Transformers' soul. I also really like the episode Possession, where Starscream's spark takes over Waspinator's body.
Allow me to present myself. Air Commander Starscream of the Decepticon Battle Fleet!
Waspinator is also one of my favorite characters, and this is kind of the only Waspinator-centric episode, even if in sort of a roundabout way.
Ooh, Waspinator loves getting focused.
Law of the Jungle is a pretty great episode as well. One of the few in the early parts of the series that really examines the morality of the actual Beast Wars themselves through the lens of the two Maximals with the most diametrically opposed worldviews, Tigatron and Dinobot. Season 1's two-part finale is also quite good. This episode, Other Voices, sees the Maximals and Predacons temporarily set their differences aside to deal with the impending threat of an alien force threatening to destroy them all when the second moon in the sky turns out to have been a planet-destroying superweapon all along. The episode ends with Optimus Primal flying a converted stasis pod equipped with explosives into the Death Star to save the planet, only to discover that Megatron has rigged the door of the pod to stay shut, removing Optimus's ability to escape the pod before the explosion, and hold on a second, this is all sounding awfully familiar.
8, 7, 6.
You know what else is kind of funny? Similarly to how ReBoot was initially cancelled on this cliffhanger, Beast Wars writers were unsure as to whether or not the show was going to be renewed on this one. Seriously, what the hell, Mainframe? There's only so much my childhood can take. Just before I wrap up here, I'd like to address a small error from the ReBoot Season 2 video, where I described Beast Wars as the second full-length CGI cartoon after ReBoot. While this was true in North America, overseas in France there was actually another fully CGI series that preceded ReBoot by a few months called Insectors, which I had never heard of until doing research for this video. Additionally, Beast Wars Season 1 premiere was also preceded by a mere 10 days, once again in France, by another show that would not be released in North America until the following year, a show which, coincidentally, also starred a talking gorilla. Maybe I'll get to that one someday. All in all, for a show that at the time was mostly relying on a thread-of-the-week episodic story structure, Beast Wars had a pretty solid first season for a kids show, but like its sister series ReBoot, the show would get much better as it progressed. Speaking of getting better, next time we're gonna jump back into the city of Mainframe for what could quite possibly be considered one of the best written seasons of a children's television show ever made, ReBoot Season 3. Thanks for watching! Drop a comment down below letting me know what you thought of Beast Wars Season 1. If you liked this video, you'd be doing me a huge favor by hitting that like button, subscribing if you're new, and sharing this video with anyone else you think may enjoy it. The support you guys have been showing me so far on this series has been amazing, and I can't tell you enough how much I appreciate it. Thank you guys once again so much for watching, and take care.